Hey everyone, Forrest here, and today we're gonna do an ultimate setup guide for the best video settings on the GoPro Hero 13 Black. Now this is not going to be a quick tips video. This is gonna be a very in-depth guide of getting the absolute maximum performance out of a camera like this. So sit back, relax, grab yourself a beverage and enjoy, and we're gonna get this camera set up to get the best possible performance. A couple quick disclaimers I wanna get out of the way early. Number one is we are not gonna be using the app for setup at all. I like to learn how to set up the camera just with the camera, because I don't always like to carry around my phone, so we're gonna be just using the GoPro settings. However, I will say, if you do like using your phone for this type of thing, all of the settings that we cover in this video are also available through the GoPro Quick app when remotely controlling your camera. Secondly, we are only focusing on video settings here. If you wanna learn about photo settings, maybe drop a comment down below and let me know that's something that you're interested in. But my photo settings videos never do quite as well. I think people more wanna learn about the video. Third, there is a full downloadable PDF quick guide in the description that you can download for free. That is a summary of everything we talk about in this video. So if you're more of a reader and less of a watcher, definitely download that. Finally, I know this may come as a surprise to many of you, but I am not an action sports extreme athlete. I'm just an average dude. I'm a dad. I take dad videos. That's what I do. I also like tech, but don't look at this as a action sports athlete tutorial. If that's you, there are a lot of creators out there who do way more adventurous, cool things than me. I'm a camera nerd. I'm a tech nerd. I'm a photo nerd. So if you want to learn the best photo settings, not necessarily for action sports, but for just getting the most out of this camera, then you're in the right place. The final thing is just that there are timestamps down below, so you can skip through to whatever part of the tutorial you want to skip to. We're going to start with things that are important to all users, and then we're going to start to specialize a little bit. So if you just want the quickest, easiest way to get up and running, we're going to talk about that, as well as if you want the pro mode settings, the best stuff, we're also going to get into that. So check down below for those timestamps. We're gonna start with the general preferences for all users. In order to get into these, we need to make sure we get our camera on. You will have to update the firmware when you first get your camera, so make sure you have your phone ready and the Quick app so you can get that done. And once you're in, we're gonna go ahead and swipe down from the top and then over to the right, and we're gonna go into preferences. Now, I'm not gonna go through all of these, but there are some important ones that I would like to get set for most users. The first is under general. I like to set the auto power off to a little bit longer. I usually like to go to 5 minutes or even 15 minutes. I find these cameras turn off a little bit too quickly. And then finally, when I'm ready to capture video, the camera's already turned off and I have to wait for it to power on. So I'm gonna turn that on. I'm also then gonna go back. I'm gonna go down to displays. Inside of displays, I like to turn on the grid. The grid is a very simple thing. So I can show you guys what that looks like, this 3x3 grid. We can see we've got these little grid lines. I find that really helpful for lining up a shot, particularly if you've got like a horizon line, those grid lines can really help. The second thing we want to do inside of displays is adjust the brightness. By default, I believe it sets to 50%. You may want to increase that to 100% if you're shooting outside. Just note that that will eat through your battery life much quicker. So you may want to leave it on the default. Also, if you're shooting in a really dark environment, you may want to reduce the brightness so that you limit eye strain and save that battery. I'm going to leave mine at about 50%. The next things I want to talk about are actually both in the reset section. And the first is formatting an SD card. GoPros use little micro SD cards and they're great, they're amazing. You can get a 1 terabyte micro SD card. The problem is SD cards will get corrupted sometime. They just don't last forever. And the harder you are on your SD cards, the more likely they are to fail. And the problem is with a lot of photographers, they'll use their SD card, their little micro SD card, as a storage location for their photos. So we want to be as nice to them as we can. The way we do that is by formatting your SD card. Now I want to make something really clear. Formatting deletes everything on the card. So don't just go format all your cards right now. You got to make sure that everything on all your cards is backed up somewhere safe, preferably on multiple external or internal hard drives. But formatting a memory card is a really good practice to get into, particularly to avoid corruption of your images or videos down the line. So I have a rule. My memory cards are in a special little container when they are ready to be formatted, meaning the images on them are backed up somewhere else. And anytime I pull a card from that bin and I put it into my camera, the first thing I do is I go in and I format it. And it even warns us here. It says delete all files and reformat your SD card. I'm gonna say yes, and it's gonna go ahead and do it. And this wipes the card clean. Now the other thing this does is this puts some useful files back on the card that the GoPro likes in order to make things work. So you don't wanna swap cards between cameras or anything like that. Now that this card has been formatted with this camera, it's good to use in this camera. If I wanna use it in another GoPro or another camera, I'm gonna wanna format it in that camera before I use it with that camera. So the TLDR is always format your cards in the camera you're gonna use them for that shooting session. Now the other thing that I wanna mention in here is the full-blown factory reset. I find that these tiny little GoPro cameras, while pretty cool and they do a lot of neat things, they get weird sometimes, just weird settings. They'll freeze, they'll power off, they'll just do weird stuff. And usually for me, it's about every 6 months, they start behaving a little bit strangely. Whenever that happens, I go in, I go to factory reset, and I reset the camera, and that sends it back to defaults. Don't do that after watching this video, but if you wanna do it before watching this video, it'll give you a good clean, there it is beeping, it'll give you a good clean slate for today. One other setting that I do wanna point out in there is if we go back into preferences and we scroll down to audio, I also really like to set my camera volume to low or even off if you don't want to have that sound at all. You can actually turn it off by going back to your quick options. We're gonna talk about these in a minute, but the little music note, that is the turn off all the sounds on the camera. So I like to turn that volume off because I really don't want the beep happening when I'm shooting. However, if you're a helmet mount person or you've got your camera in a hard to access location, I'd set that camera volume to high so that I have a good kind of noticeable sound when I start recording, stop recording, and all of those different things. So now that we know about the general preferences, let's talk about the quick buttons on the camera. We can get to our quick buttons by just simply swiping down, and we have 8 quick buttons, one of which we've already talked about. So let's go ahead and go through these. The first button is voice control. We can turn that on and off by simply tapping this blue button right here. This allows us to say things like GoPro start recording or GoPro stop recording. And the camera, you can see it just started right there and stopped. It will start recording or stop recording for you, which is pretty cool. I'm not a huge fan of this because again, I'm not usually mounting my camera to a helmet or somewhere hard to reach. So I like to just push the shutter button on the top, but that option is there for you folks. I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off. The second one is the beep. We already talked about that. You can have beep on, you can have beep off, and again, beep volume is set up in the general preferences. Number 3 here is the screensaver. This just changes the screen to display a screensaver after a certain amount of time. I like to leave that on, sure, sounds good to me. Number 4 is a lock. Now this one's important. If we turn the lock on, there we are, screen lock is on. If I swipe out of this setting, you'll notice that the touch screen has been disabled. And this is really good for underwater shooting or anytime, like I've done long time lapses before where I don't wanna accidentally adjust anything mid time lapse. So the screen lock will just prevent any inputs unless I tap on the screen and then drag this over, and that will disable the lock. So again, we swipe down, that 4th one is our touch screen lock. Number 5 is your front screen mode. GoPro Hero 13 Black has a front facing screen, and this controls what's on the front display. And you can see we have front display off, we have status only, actual screen, or the full screen. My favorite by far is actual screen, because if you're vlogging, that gives you a real good idea from the front screen of what you're actually capturing. The only exception to this is I would maybe set this to screen off in situations where my camera was mounted to a helmet and I didn't need to waste power having the front facing screen turned on. So I'm gonna leave mine on actual screen and select. Number 6 is orientation lock. And this just simply means that the camera is going to keep the menu system locked, the orientation of the menu system locked to whatever it is right now. The menu system on this camera will rotate depending on which position you have the camera in. Say if you mount it upside down, the menu will rotate so that upside down is right side up. It's kind of cool, but sometimes you might want to take upside down footage or something like that. Whatever you want to do, when you tap this button, it's going to lock the orientation of the footage and of the menu to whatever it currently is. So if you're in vertical mode and you lock it, you are going to be capturing vertical. If your camera's horizontal, you're going to be capturing horizontal. Whatever it is, when you tap that button, it is locking to that orientation. Finally, option number 7, very simple, is our LEDs or the tally light on the camera. The camera has a little front-facing and rear-facing red LED light, and we can turn that on or off. I like the tally light. It tells me when I'm recording or when I'm not recording, but if you are, say, recording a concert and you don't want that little blinking red light blinking at your person that you're videoing, you may want to turn that off. Finally, setting number 8 is for the lens attachment that you're using. This is a new option for the Hero 13, and you can see that auto detect is one of the options. So if you have one of the new fancy Hero 13 lens attachments, they're like macro lens or the anamorphic lens or whatever it is, auto detect will detect which of those you have attached. I don't have any of those, so I could set mine to just the standard lens. I don't have anything attached, but I do want to point out that there is an option for the Max Lens Mod 2.0. I do own that. I bought it for the Hero 12, and it's nice here that I can have an option to turn that on in the camera. However, I'm going to leave mine to standard lens because as of right now, I don't have anything extra attached. So these quick action buttons are great. They allow us to turn some things on and off. Honestly though, I usually leave everything at the default that I've got it at right now. So I'm gonna go ahead and just swipe up and get us out of those options. And that concludes our general quick button setup. Next, we're gonna get into the specifics of setting up the camera either in the easy mode or the pro mode. Before we do though, I need to do a little bit of teaching so that all of you understand some general video terminology that I'm gonna be using throughout this video. Namely, I wanna talk about frame rate and resolution, as these are the two things that have the biggest effect on the quality that you can get out of this camera. Let's start with resolution. Resolution simply controls how detailed every frame of your video is. If you didn't know, video is just a bunch of still images that are run or played back quickly enough that our eyes see it as a moving picture. It's why it's called motion picture, right? There's lots of moving images and we're seeing them so quickly that it looks like smooth motion. And resolution is measured very simply. It's the number of pixels or little squares of light that you have in the frame of video that you're shooting. So some resolutions you may have heard of are 4K, right? 4,000 4K, 4,000 pixels. 4K resolution means that if you paused on your video and you zoomed in really close on one of your frames of video and you counted every little pixel across the top of the frame of video, you would get about 4,000 pixels in width across the frame of your video. 5.3K, that's a resolution that we have access to on this camera, means that if you zoomed in and counted, you've had 5.3 thousand pixels from one side of the frame to the other side of the frame. 2K is 2,000 pixels across, which is very similar to our standard HD video, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels. So it's just resolution. The higher the resolution, the more pixels, the more detail you have on every single frame of video. Very, very simple. Now, why would we want a higher resolution? Well, there's a couple reasons. For one, you're gonna get a little bit more detail, a little bit more nice information. Things are gonna look a little bit better. But the second reason is with higher resolution comes the ability to crop or punch in on your footage a little bit more. So I'll give you guys a quick example. Let's say that you're shooting a video clip of a couple of your friends throwing a Frisbee on the beach, right? And the GoPro has a really wide angle lens. So you know you wanna come in close on your group of friends playing Frisbee. Well, unfortunately, you can't get closer because you're already as close as you can get. But you know that if you shoot a higher resolution, it means you'll have more ability to crop in, to punch in closer in that video that you shoot because you started with more pixels. So if you have higher resolution, more pixels, it means you can zoom in a little bit more. So you get better quality and you get more ability to zoom. The problem with that is, and by zoom I just mean crop, the problem with that is it's harder on the camera, so you get more heat buildup. Sometimes you get more blurriness, which we'll talk a little bit about, or compression, which we'll talk a little bit about. So I don't always recommend using the highest resolution that your camera has access to, but that's what resolution is. Now the second thing is frame rate. Frame rate is how many of those still images the camera is shooting every second. Now I'll make it simple for you. You watching this on YouTube right now, you are watching this video at 30 frames per second, meaning as I'm talking, you're seeing 30 still photos every second that goes by. And things look smooth, right? If I like move my arms, things look smooth, they look clear, you can see things, you can understand them. Well, 30 frames per second is what most videos are played back at in the end, meaning when you put your epic snowmobile trip on YouTube, most people will watch it at 30 frames per second. So why do we need more than 30? And the reason is slow motion. Think about this. If you record at 60 frames per second, and you know that you're gonna post the video at 30 frames per second, that means you can play the video back at 1/2 speed in your editing. You can basically slow it down by 1/2, and it will still look smooth, it'll still look good to the viewer. So the higher the frame rate, the more frames per second, the more ability you have to run it slow motion in your editing software. You don't have to, but it gives you the ability to do that. So if you shoot 60 frames per second, that allows us to play back the video at 1/2 speed with everything still looking smooth. If you shoot 120 frames per second, you can play back at 1/4 speed. So even motion, right? Which is pretty cool. So higher frame rate means more ability to use slow motion. So with these two pieces of information, we can start to make really informed decisions. Because here's the problem. You can't get both. If you want 240 frames per second, which would let you use your camera at 1/8 speed in editing, when you got into editing, you could play things back at 1/8 speed. If you want to do that, because you want that epic slow-mo, B-roll, beautiful shot, unfortunately, that's not going to be available at 5.3K resolution. So it's a sliding scale. With higher resolution comes a lower frame rate, and with a higher frame rate comes a lower resolution. So you, the viewer out there, you need to make informed decisions about, in this situation, do I care more about frame rate or do I care more about resolution? If you don't want to think about it, my go-to for most everybody all the time is 4K at 60 frames per second. That's a pretty good just set it and forget it. You're getting a really high resolution and you're also getting a really high frame rate. So if you just want to be like, Forrest, you know what? I don't care. I don't want to deal with that. 4K 60 will be really good. But if you really want to season it to taste and you're just shooting, say, I don't know, say you go on vacation and you're just shooting like some pictures of your family at Disney World, right? Who knows? Well, you're not really gonna need to slow-mo that. So I would do 30 frames per second because we're not gonna need to slow-mo. And if I shoot at 30 frames per second, I can use 5.3K resolution. So why don't I? That sounds great. Well, maybe 5.3K, you're pushing the camera a little harder. You only have one battery for the day. So do you really need 5.3K? Well, maybe not. Maybe I'll dial it back to 4K at 30 so I can preserve battery. So here's the problem that I'm driving at. There's no one size fits all option for everybody. You need to weigh battery life, quality, resolution, frame rate, and figure out what's best for you. If you're an action sports athlete and you're gonna, like, I don't know, take a dirt bike off an epic jump and you wanna shoot it at 240 frames per second, you should, because you're gonna wanna slow that down. You're gonna wanna make it look epic. But at 240 frames per second, you're not gonna get as high of a resolution. So we have resolution, we have frame rate, and we know that the harder we push our camera, the lower our battery life will be, the quicker our battery will run down. There is one other thing I wanna mention in this whole kind of swirling mess of frame rate and resolution, and that is the compression, or what's called the bit rate. Now stay with me here, I know this is getting technical, but here's the gist. The higher or harder you push your camera, These little GoPros, they don't have much way of cooling themselves down. They don't have much way of writing to a card that fast. So I'll just warn you, when you start to push the camera to its limits, meaning the max frame rate and max resolution, not only do you wear your battery down quicker, you also are gonna start to get a little bit of compression in your video clips. And what compression is it means that if you zoom in on the video, things will just kind of look blurry. They'll look chunky. They won't look super clear and good. So just know that as you're at that, if you're at that bleeding edge of performance, right? 5.3K at 60 frames per second, there's gotta be corners cut by the camera to allow that to happen. And again, I wanna harken back to my one size fits all of 4K 60. It used to be that 4K 60 for a camera like this was impossible. Now 4K 60 on a camera like this is kind of in the middle. And that means not only are we getting a good resolution, not only are we getting a frame rate that'll allow a 1/2 speed playback, good slow-mo, we're also not pushing the camera as hard. So we're gonna get good battery life and not as much compression, which is super cool. So just remember that you're really weighing those 4 things. You push the camera too hard, start to lose battery life, start to get more compression, but you also wanna have enough resolution to do what you wanna do, and you also need enough frame rate. So beginner users, advanced users, we're gonna be seeing these options as we start to dive into the camera. So it doesn't really matter which way you wanna go. Resolution, frame rate, bit rate, and battery life are all omnipresent things you gotta worry about with a GoPro camera. Now that we know the overarching settings for the GoPro, it's time to dive into the specifics of video. And what I want to do is start with our easy mode settings. Now, when I say easy mode, the GoPro actually has a great way to determine whether you want to be on the pro mode or the easy mode. So to make sure we're on easy mode, we're going to swipe down from the top, we're going to go over, and we're going to make sure that we are set to controls easy right here. I'm going to go ahead and select that. You'll notice that you also can select Controls Pro, which we will go through in the future in this video. I'm gonna go ahead and throw it on easy. From here, I'm gonna go ahead and swipe up and get to our main settings. Now in easy mode, there are very few options we have to worry about. The first one I wanna talk about is right here where it says standard video. If we tap on that, we can see we have the option of standard video or HDR video. Now, before I get into the differences, I wanna make something very clear. Some modes in easy mode, some of the options are not available with other options. So you may notice that as you change the resolution or the frame rate, other options become unavailable. And again, that's because we're running into the limits of what frame rate and resolution the GoPro can possibly use. Now, in the topic of standard video or HDR video, I'm gonna make it super simple. If you're shooting in a bright sunny day with tons of available light, it's bright, it's hot, you've got your sunglasses on in order to make your eyes comfortable, I would use HDR. HDR really excels in those brightly lit situations. If, however, it's a little bit more dim, maybe it's a cloudy day, maybe you're shooting in low light conditions, maybe you're shooting underwater, in those situations, I would go with standard mode. If you wanna just set it and forget it, I think standard is the way to go. What HDR is gonna do is it's gonna try to restore detail in the highlights and the shadows of your video clips to give you more what's called dynamic range. Essentially, you'll have more detail in the frame. The problem is it can only work well when there's plenty of available light. So it's one of those things that I think is good situationally, but it's not something I'm gonna leave on all the time. Now that we've talked about the center here, we've got 4 buttons around the outside of the screen. Let's go through each one in turn. The one I want to talk about first is this button in the lower right. And this is our selection for resolution. Now we already talked about what resolution is, right? It's the quality or the amount of pixels in our video clips. And we can see we have basic, standard, and highest. Now, this, I'm not gonna give you guys a one-size-fits-all answer. It depends on whether you wanna crop into the footage that you shoot, or whether you wanna maybe reduce the quality here to save battery life, or allow yourself to use a higher frame rate down the line. Again, I did mention in my resolution and frame rate section that I'm a big fan of 4K, and 4K is the standard quality option. So again, if you do wanna set it and forget it, that would be a good place. However, a lot of you are gonna wanna shoot the absolute best quality the GoPro can shoot, and that's gonna be where 5.3K comes in. The next option I want to talk about is the one in the upper left-hand corner. It's this little 1x right here. Very simply, this is your slow-mo option. How slow motion do you want to be able to go? Essentially, this is frame rate, okay? Now, by default, at our 1x frame rate, that's 30 frames per second. And like we talked about, that means that if you shoot footage in 30 frames per second, you're not going to have any ability to slow it down in your editing software. If you did slow it down, it would look kind of jittery like this. It wouldn't look super smooth. So if you are gonna wanna slow down your footage, we can see we have 2x, which allows us to do 1/2 speed. We have 4x, which allows us to do 1/4 speed. Or finally, we have 8x, which allows us to do 1/8 speed. So I would judge my frame rate decision, my slow-mo decision, based on how fast the thing I'm shooting is moving, right? So if you're like Formula One shooting, and you're right by the track, you're probably gonna wanna be at 8x because you're gonna wanna be able to slow that down a lot to really see all that cool detail. If you're just shooting yourself biking around, well, 2x or 60 frames per second is gonna be plenty in those situations. So now that I've got mine set on the standard quality at 2x, I'm at 4K 60. Again, that's kind of my go-to walk around settings for most purposes. I wanna talk about these other two options. The first one is the upper right, and this is our framing selection. We can see we have three options. We have widescreen, we have vertical, and we have full frame. Now, honestly, I'm gonna recommend most folks leave this on widescreen for most situations. And the reason is because YouTube, the platform you're watching this on right now, has a 16:9 aspect ratio. That means that if you were to divide the frame up, you'd have 16 units across and 9 units tall, 16:9. And that's what we're used to seeing most video in. That's what TVs are, all that kind of stuff. However, phones, most people use vertically, so they're 9:16 vertical. So if you are shooting footage that you know is gonna get turned into, say, an Instagram reel, well, in that instance, I would go to the vertical option because then you can see on the GoPro screen here, it's gonna auto crop to the vertical aspect ratio, which is pretty sweet. So you can compose your shot, you can work in vertical. You also could just shoot horizontal and rotate the camera 90 degrees. That would work totally fine as well. But I kind of like the way that they've laid this out. So vertical is an option. And then finally, full frame is an option. And the GoPro sensor actually has an 8:7 aspect ratio. It's almost square, the sensor on the GoPro. And so if you wanna get all of the frame, really everything the GoPro sensor can capture, that's where the full frame option would come in. I like full frame a lot. The problem is you have to crop it to make it fit on a phone. For example, if you're trying to, show an Instagram reel or you're trying to make a YouTube video and someone's gonna watch it on a 16:9 device, this requires some cropping. So here's what I would say. If you wanna just shoot and then take your footage and throw it right on Instagram or right on YouTube, then I would take a moment in your framing options and say, hey, am I creating vertical content or am I creating horizontal content? Although, if you are okay spending a little bit of time editing, then I would always use full frame because then you're capturing every bit of detail that the camera can capture. There's no cropping in the camera, and that gives you more ability to crop in post-production. Now, a little pro tip here, I also really like the full frame option when combined with the highest quality of 5.3K. And that means we're really getting every bit of information that this sensor is capable of producing. But do note that if we are on full frame and we are on the highest resolution, if we go into our frame rate options, we're gonna be limited to only 2x or 60 frames per second. So do keep that in mind. Again, there are limitations here as we start to pull these different knobs and sliders to adjust things differently. I'm gonna go back to a standard for most folks in the easy mode settings. We're gonna be on widescreen. And again, I'm gonna throw it back on 4K at a 60 frames per second frame rate. Now the final option is the lower left, and this is our zooming mode or our lens mode. You can kind of think of it different ways. This kind of controls how wide angle or how narrow the lens is. And honestly, the choice is kind of yours here. I'm gonna make it kind of simple though. And not all these options will be available on all the other options, like I said. But my favorite one is linear for a lot of situations. Linear will take the GoPro, which naturally has a very fisheye, like wide screen look to it, and it'll make it look like a normal camera. So if you're like shooting vacation photos and you're with your family and you're just using the GoPro as like a vacation capture camera, linear is the way to go. It'll make the GoPro look like cell phone footage or look like a DSLR or mirrorless camera. It looks more professional with that option. However, it gets rid of that ultra-wide GoPro immersive look that they're so famous for. So on the other hand, if you're trying to shoot like FPV video, first-person view, right? You're trying to get someone into the seat of whatever you're doing, right? Say you're base jumping and you wanna like bring someone into the scene. Well, in those situations, you may wanna go with the widest, which is hyperview. Hyperview actually takes the entirety of that 8:7 sensor aspect ratio and it squishes it down into the widescreen format that we are set to. So hyperview will basically give you the most field of view in your frame. So really cool that we can adjust this. My favorite two for most things are wide or linear, but I recommend you guys play with these to see. I'll also point out there's a linear plus horizon lock. This is actually gonna be linear, so it's gonna get rid of all that kind of fisheye gross effect. It's also gonna lock the horizon, which means if you take the camera and you go like this, the horizon's gonna stay locked on steady, which is pretty cool for a lot of things. If you're trying to capture some motion, but you don't want to have a lot of shake in your footage, horizon lock does a great job at that, okay? For me though, again, linear is probably my go-to and wide is my second go-to when I do wanna preserve a little bit of that fisheye or widescreen effect that the GoPro is famous for. So you all, those are our easy mode settings. Now, there's no best option for everybody. So I recommend you take those 5 settings we just talked about and think about what's best for your given situation. With that said, I've got 2 types of people that I wanna kind of break down and review what I would use for each one of you. For vacation video shooters, I would be on standard video here in the middle, unless you're in bright sun, and then I would change it to HDR. I would recommend a resolution of standard or 4K. I would adjust my slow-mo to 2x or 60 frames per second. I would be in the widescreen mode unless I knew I was creating footage for Instagram Reels and I wanted that vertical format. I may switch this to vertical, but I'm probably gonna leave it on widescreen. And finally, inside of my lens options, I'm gonna put it on linear. This is gonna be great for like 99% of cool, fun vacation photos with the family. So if that's what you're looking for, this is a great way to do it. The only exception would be some ussies, right? If you're gonna take a selfie with you and a bunch of people, the GoPro is great for that on vacation. I would adjust the linear to wide or even super view to get even more field of view and really bring the viewer in. It lets you take some epic ussies. So if you wanna take a cool selfie or an ussie with multiple people, that would be a great way to do it. If you are an action sports athlete or you do a lot of outdoor adventure stuff, again, I'm gonna recommend standard video in most situations. I would change it to HDR in those brightly lit sunny situations. For my resolution, I would recommend, again, the standard mode. I'm also gonna recommend a slow-mo of 4x, so we have 120 frames per second. It's gonna give us a little bit more ability to slow things down in post-production, which is pretty cool. And then finally, I'm gonna recommend the widescreen framing, again, unless you know you're creating vertical content for Instagram or YouTube. And finally, inside of our lens options, I'm gonna recommend super view for the widest possible field of view. Again, that's gonna make the viewer feel like they are there with you in the frame, they're experiencing what you're experiencing. It's a very immersive way to view video as a viewer. And that concludes our easy mode settings for the GoPro Hero 13 Black. All right, now it's time to get into our pro mode settings. Now, quick disclaimer, this is going to be for people who wanna get the absolute most out of this camera, but more than that, the people who are willing to use an editing program like Adobe Premiere Pro to take the footage from this camera and craft it into what they're looking for. I'm gonna talk about some very advanced terms in video, so if you are not an experienced video shooter, I'd probably recommend sticking to the easy mode until you start to get familiar with the camera in that mode, and then start to maybe take on the pro controls. I do also want to mention that the difference between the footage on easy mode and pro mode is pretty minimal. You're talking about maybe an extra 5 to 10% of performance. So if you are a shooter and you're like, you know what, easy mode feels great, that's awesome. More power to you, do it. However, there are some shooters out there who want to match GoPro footage to other cameras and get the most out of these, and that's what this is for. So in order to get into pro mode, we are going to swipe down, we're going to go over, and we're going to change the controls to pro. And now all of a sudden we are unlocking every ability, every option that this camera has. Now, it's different than easy mode in the way that these 4 buttons on the outside now are customizable. We can turn those into whatever. I'm not going to cover that in this video simply because everybody's going to want different things there. So I recommend that you guys adjust these 4 controls to be whatever works for you. I'll show you where we set that, but I'm not going to give you like the best 4 modes because it's different for everybody. Instead, to change our settings, we're gonna tap down here on the bottom center and we're gonna get these different presets. Now you can make video presets for different situations. It's pretty cool. The GoPro though will give you a couple options right out of the gate. I'm not gonna mess with those. Instead, I'm gonna go to create a new preset and now we can start really customizing the GoPro and getting it exactly the way we want it to work. So first off, I'm gonna select video here. Next, it's going to give us an option of what profile we'd like to use. We have an option of standard, HDR, or log. So standard, again, is going to be my go-to for most things. HDR I will use in bright, sunny conditions as it'll give me a little bit more dynamic range. And then finally, log is going to be a very flat, muted color profile that you can apply LUTs or lookup tables to season to taste. I would not recommend using log unless you already know what log is and you know that you want to use it. It's not like a beginner setting. If you do know what log is though, and say you maybe use a Sony a7R IV for your primary shooting camera and you want to take a GoPro and integrate the GoPro footage with the a7R IV footage and make them look like they were shot on the same camera, log can be a great way to do that. But I want to point out, it even warns you, log video requires color correction. Unprocessed footage will look flat or dull. That's the point of log. It's supposed to look flat so that in post, we can edit it to match other cameras. So I'm gonna go ahead and say don't show again and okay, because that's a good option for some folks. However, for most things, standard is the way to go. Now, I also want to point out that when we select these different modes, we are limited down below in the other options that we have. So if you don't pick standard, you may not see all the same options that I have down below, and that's just because there are certain limitations with the GoPro. Next is framing, very simple. We have 16:9, 9:16 vertical, 4:3 horizontal, and 8:7 horizontal. You guys are the pro mode, right? This is the pro mode settings. I'm gonna be on 8:7 most of the time. 8:7 is the native aspect ratio of the GoPro sensor, the most true rendition of what the camera captures in that 8:7 aspect ratio. The only disadvantage is it's going to require cropping in post-production or squeezing in post-production to have it fit a standard YouTube screen or phone screen. Scrolling on down, we have resolution. We already addressed this earlier in the video. The higher the resolution, the harder it is on your batteries, the lower frame rate you can use, but you get more pixels, which allows you to crop in more and just have generally more quality. If I'm gonna shoot 8:7, I'm also usually gonna be at 5.3K and 30 frames per second. That is maximizing what the GoPro sensor is capable of. You'll notice though, at 8:7, 5.3K, 30, we have no option for a faster frame rate. It doesn't let us do it. So if you know you need 60 or 120 frames per second, you're gonna need to either reduce back to 4K, which will give us 4K 60 at the 8:7 aspect ratio, or if you need faster than that, we're actually gonna have to go 16:9, and then we can go 4K 120, or even 5.3K at 60. So again, there's all of these levers that need to get pulled to get the best out of this camera. And again, like I said earlier in this video multiple times, 4K 60 is a sweet spot for a lot of users. However, if I really want 8x7, I might go 5.3K 30 and just know I don't have the ability to slow things down. Now you guys, I know I'm going fast. Again, I wanna remind you there is a downloadable PDF in the description that will walk through all of this and give you guys my best settings. So if you wanna read this and have a little refresher, something to bring with you in the field, that's a great thing to download. Scrolling down, we'll notice that the only option for the digital lens at 8x7 5.3K 30 is the wide lens. And that's because we're using the entirety of the sensor. There's no way for it to crop in the camera because we're using everything. I do want to point out, just for the clarity of it, if I go 16:9 and we go 4K and we go 60, which is another good kind of general purpose walk around option, now we do have all those same lens options that we covered in easy mode. So we have linear plus horizon lock, where the horizon will stay level all the time. We have linear, where it removes the fisheye effect and things just look normal, looks like a standard DSLR or mirrorless camera. We have wide, where it uses not really any, it's kind of the natural lens of the GoPro. We have super view, which lets in more, and we have hyper view, which actually takes the entire 8x7 sensor and it squeezes it down to 16:9, giving you a very immersive feel. Hyper smooth is very simple. Hyper smooth is the stabilization built into the GoPro. It's really sweet. I really like it almost all the time. The only time I'm gonna turn off hyper smooth is for situations when I'm on a tripod or I want the shake of the event to come through in my footage. Except for situations like that, it's something that I leave on all the time. I do also want to point out auto boost. Auto boost will basically toe the line between cropping in on your footage and giving you enough stabilization. I should mention with hyper smooth on, there is a crop applied to your footage. So auto boost will sometimes use less cropping when it needs less stabilization, and it'll sometimes use more cropping when it needs more stabilization. I'm not a huge fan of that option myself. I like to have the control of either on or off, but that's what that does. So those are the things that make the most difference in how to set your camera. And again, I don't have a best choice. So go through those options, see what's available, maybe do some test shooting as well. Now, scrolling on down, we have the capture section. And this is pretty cool. These are some little tweaks we can use on the GoPro to do different things. Now, we're not gonna do an in-depth run through of each of these, but I wanna tell you what they are. So scheduled capture allows us to set our GoPro to start capturing sometime in the future. You can set a date and a time that you want the camera to start. I used this the other night. I was shooting a star trail photo and I told my GoPro, I think I set it up at about 6 p.m. and I set scheduled capture and I said, hey GoPro, at 10 p.m. I want you to turn on and start capturing footage. And scheduled capture, I set that to 10 p.m. Sure enough, 10 p.m. camera turns on, starts shooting. Pretty cool. Duration is simply how long you want the camera to shoot for. So if you want to take a 30-minute clip and be able to walk away and go do other things, the camera will stop recording after the set duration. Hindsight is really cool. Hindsight basically tells the GoPro to record all the time. So even if you don't push the button, it's recording constantly. And then what happens is whenever you press the button, it saves that recording. And this is really useful for situations when you don't know what's gonna happen in the action going on in front of you. So for example, say you're watching like a motocross race and you're at the base of a jump and the riders are jumping off the jump and you wanna get a rider in the air, right? And you don't know when that's gonna happen. Well, if you turn on hindsight and set it to 15 seconds, it's gonna record all the time, obviously eating through battery, but as soon as you hit the record button, it'll go back in time 15 seconds and save everything that happened 15 seconds before and then through the rest of your recording. We also, on some frame rates and resolutions, have an option for 30-second hindsight as well. However, these may or may not be available depending on your resolution and your frame rate. Finally, timer is a self-timer, right? If you want to get a video clip or a photo of you and some friends, you can throw on either a 3-second or a 10-second self-timer, push the button, it'll count down from 3 seconds or 10 seconds, and then capture the clip or the photo. Zooming is only going to be available on some modes. We can see I can't tap it right here. However, just know zoom is a digital zoom. It's not actually a zoom lens. So I shouldn't say usually, 100% of the time, I leave my zoom at 1x. And if I want to zoom, I do it in post-production. Do note though that zoom is only going to be available when you're shooting lower resolutions. Like if I go down to 1080p at 60 frames per second and maybe I'm on linear, now zoom is all of a sudden going to be a choice where I can zoom into up to 2x. I'm never going to use that because it's just cropping. I'm just going to do it in Premiere if I ever want to do it that way. So those are our capture settings. Next, we're gonna go down to Pro Tune. Now, this is where there's a lot more kind of really nitty-gritty options that I think a lot of you who are watching this pro video might like. So the first option is bit depth. Bit depth is very similar to the quality of your footage. It's how good your footage looks. And if you have the option, I highly recommend increasing to 10-bit video. It's gonna give you more quality, things are just gonna look better. So if you have that option, do it. However, that option will not be available at all frame rates and all resolutions. The next option is bit rate. And again, I'm gonna increase this to high. We can see at the base level, it's not gonna use as many megabits per second. We can see if we go all the way up to high, it's gonna use 120 megabits per second. I mentioned bit rate back in our frame rate and resolution discussion. And I told you guys that at higher frame rates and higher resolutions, you're gonna be pushing the camera to the limit. If we increase our bit rate to high, that limit is gonna become a little bit higher, meaning we can push a little bit more quality out of the camera. So I highly recommend you set your bitrate to high. Just note that again, it is going to increase the file size of your video clips, so you'll take up more space on your memory card. And it also, I don't know this, but probably has a reduction in battery life. Shutter speed I'm gonna leave on auto. This gets into the discussion of should you use ND filters and do the 2 times your frame rate as your shutter speed rule. You can definitely do that. However, with action cameras, particularly with the hyper smooth stabilization, we really wanna let the camera pick its own shutter speed. I will leave a link down in the description to a video I did on using neutral density filters with action cameras. You guys can watch that if you wanna learn a little bit more about it. But there's just a lot of downsides to locking your shutter speed on an action camera, all right? EV comp is exposure value compensation. It just allows you to make your footage a little bit brighter or a little bit darker than the GoPro thinks is correct. This would be in situations where maybe you have a really bright sky. Say you're shooting up at yourself riding a bike and you're a dark blob on the really bright sky behind you. The GoPro may have a tendency to make you a little bit too dark. And that would be a situation where you see the footage on the back of the camera, you go into EV comp, and maybe you set your EV comp at +1 or 1.5 or +2. And that's just telling the camera, hey, whatever you think the footage should be exposed at, go a little bit brighter or a little bit darker to make things look right. Generally, we're gonna wanna leave that at 0, and that's actually a really big thing to remember if you change it, because sometimes you'll be shooting too bright footage down the line and you won't remember that your EV comp is still set to +2. The next one's probably my biggest, and that is white balance. I really recommend that if you are a pro user of the GoPro, you take the time to manually adjust your white balance for the scene. White balance controls how blue or orange your footage is. And essentially every light in the world has some sort of color temperature to it, is what we call it. Some lights are bluer, some lights are warmer, and we wanna make sure the camera is set to compensate for the warmer or cooler light we're shooting under. The problem with auto is the white balance will change during a clip. So if you go from a shady region to a sunny region, you'll see a color shift happen to your footage. And I really don't like that. I like to set the white balance and let it be the same through the duration of my video clip. So all you gotta do is drag it up and down. It'll show you a preview. You guys can see here on the back of the camera, it goes from very cool to very warm. And I wanna show you guys here, if I put it on auto, notice how blue this desk down here looks. This desk down here is supposed to be a bamboo warm color. And with auto white balance on the GoPro, it's making it really blue. So I could manually come in here and set my white balance to 5500K, which happens to be the temperature of the lights that I'm shooting. and now my desk looks proper. So it's really cool. It will correct, you can correct for it. If you shoot your face and you notice that you look a little bit blue, right? That's a super common thing. The GoPro sees the warmth in our faces and it blues things in a little bit. You can go in and manually set your white balance. So that's a thing. I will warn you, it's a slippery slope. Once you start to set it, you kind of want to set it every time. So I know some folks, they're like, you know what? I want minimal things to worry about when shooting. Probably should use the easy mode if you're in that camp, but that's where the white balance is. One other thing I'll say is I highly recommend making the white balance one of your 4 buttons around the outside of the screen so that you can quickly and easily adjust it. ISO min and ISO max I'm gonna leave be. We really don't want the GoPro to be constrained to certain ISOs that it can use. ISO controls the camera's ability to capture light, and there's a byproduct of ISO where the higher ISO you use, the more noise you get. And there's a lot of technicalities to ISO. I'm vastly simplifying for the sake of this video. We could talk for hours about how ISO works at the sensor and image processor level, but just know that I wouldn't restrict it. If you really wanted the camera to never go to higher ISOs so that you never had too much noise, you could go into ISO max and maybe restrict it down to 200. The problem is that's not giving the camera any headroom to go higher than that. So sometimes you're just gonna end up with footage that's too dark. And I'd much rather have properly exposed footage than footage that's too dark, but maybe doesn't have as much noise. So for me, ISO max is always gonna be up at auto, or even if you just wanna set it up at the max of 6400 so that the camera can push it as high as it needs to go. Sharpness, I'm gonna reduce down to low, because if there's any sharpening, I wanna do it myself in Premiere. I find that GoPro sharpening is a little bit too heavy-handed, particularly at standard, so I like to dial that back. I will say though, dang, the footage out of the GoPro on standard is like, ooh, that looks really good. The sharpening does look nice. It's just that it doesn't give you any ability to go higher because you'll start over sharpening. It looks weird. And also sometimes it goes a little bit too hard. So I like low, and then I'll season it to taste in editing. Denoise, I'm gonna set this to medium. The GoPro does do a good job at denoising your footage, particularly at those higher ISOs. However, there's a lot of really powerful denoising tools made by not GoPro that may do better. So if you use something like the Topaz denoise, that's more for still images, but any sort of denoising in video, Premiere has its own denoising. If you like those, maybe set your denoise to low and do it manually through your editing software. For me, it's one thing to not worry about. I'm gonna leave mine on medium. Finally, we have color. You have natural, flat, or vibrant. I like the natural look. I think it looks good, and it gives us room in Premiere or whatever editing program you use to pump things up a little bit. Do note that on the log mode, I don't think we're gonna have this option. Log is log, and it's not gonna have an option to pump up the color saturation. One quick note I'll give you guys, if you ever watch the GoPro marketing videos, first off, they do an amazing job with those marketing videos, but many of the best shots that I see are definitely shot on vibrant, or they have a lot of vibrance and saturation added to them in post-production. So if you guys are entering clips in like their GoPro yearly challenge, I definitely recommend maybe shooting in vibrant or just being a little bit more heavy-handed on your vibrant controls inside of Premiere to give your footage a little bit of an extra like kick. Finally, we're gonna get down to these audio settings. There's 4 of them, they're very straightforward. Raw audio, I'm gonna leave off. What raw audio does is if you turn it on, you're gonna get a separate audio track recorded with every clip. I listened to both. I didn't hear any advantage, so I don't wanna deal with an audio clip and a separate video clip with the audio baked in. It's kind of annoying, so I'm gonna leave raw audio off. Under audio tuning, you can see it says tunes audio recording to capture balanced, true to life sound. That's great for most shoots. Or you can actually have it adjust for just vocals. Premiere has tools that do the same thing, so I leave mine on standard most of the time, and then I'm gonna let Premiere's cool essential sound panel do a lot of that work for me. Number 3, we have wind reduction. I actually do like this. GoPro does do a good job with wind reduction. I leave mine on auto because I don't like to think about it. It's one more thing to not have to worry about. However, I do want to say you can just lock it on all the time, or turn it off all the time. The better way to deal with wind noise though would be to get something like the GoPro Media Mod, the little external microphone that the GoPro slides into, and get a little fuzzy for it or a little foamy that will help cut that wind noise. Even better would be use an external mic with the GoPro with like a real good little fuzzy bit around the microphone to really cut out the wind noise at the source. This is all digital wind noise reduction. It's always better to just eliminate it before it even gets captured, if possible, with a little fuzzy. I always feel weird saying this too. Fuzzies are actually called dead cats, or I like to call them dead hamsters in the case of a GoPro because they're so small, but that just feels so mean. But it's a dead cat, right? A fuzzy's called a dead cat. Foamies are also a thing. Foamies exist too. They're like, here, that's an example of a foamy. So foamies also do a little bit, but not as much. The fourth audio option is only there if you have a media mod connected, little GoPro accessory, and that would allow us to adjust which mic on the media mod we were gonna use, because the media mod has a front-facing and a rear-facing microphone. Finally, coming on down here, you can make your dashboard custom per preset. So the dashboard are those little quick buttons, and you can have the GoPro remember what quick button settings you use in each of your different presets. They're getting really technical. I'm gonna turn that off because those 8 quick buttons we already talked about, I want those to remain the same regardless of what preset I happen to be using, but that's what that is. And then finally, you have your 4 shortcuts. So these are the 4 things that you are going to adjust the most. They're those 4 buttons that you'll have in the lower left, lower right, upper left, and upper right of the camera screen. And I already mentioned white balance would be an absolute go-to for me. Wind noise reduction may be another one that you might consider putting there. And then I'd probably put frame rate and resolution as your other 2 so that you can adjust it that way. But again, season this to taste as far as what you're looking for. Once we get this, we're gonna go ahead and select the check button, and now we can actually set our preset name. So this preset, you might wanna make your action preset. So you can see there's some names. I'm gonna call it my epic preset. Gonna go ahead and select that. And now I have a new preset called Epic with all of the settings we just configured. I can come in here and adjust it down the line. You can see it's added Epic to the list of presets that I have. And those 3 little lines there will allow me to come in and customize that preset again, just like we did when we initially set it up. So you can make as many of these presets as you want for different shooting situations. You might want one for vacation, one for action, one for vlogging, one for whatever, and each one can have its own settings fit for its own certain purpose. I really like the way that GoPro's done this. It's grown a lot since its first iteration of how they started doing presets, and I think it's a really great way to make our lives a lot easier. All right, everybody, that concludes this video. Again, if you're looking for my quick setting guide, link down in the description. You can go ahead and download that for free. It's super easy. If you guys got value out of this video, I would really appreciate you dropping a like down below and hitting subscribe for future videos. If you guys want to learn more about the GoPro platform, let me know down in the comments what you want to learn. I really like these little cameras. I like creating content on them. So if you guys are looking to learn something specific, let me know down below. As well, just put any questions down there that you might have. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope to see you in a future video.